All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our June in the Boardroom, where today we are going to talk about a very important topic, money. Now, I have been promised that even though we have been talking about this as county revenue bonds, I've been promised by Andy Phillips that this is going to be a riveting discussion today. And so I'm glad that Andy was able to join us today, along with three other attorneys from Attolles Law. Usually we have one or two. This topic is so important and so riveting that today we have four people joining us. So I'm very excited for that. Before I turn it over to our presenters today, just a couple of quick reminders for our In the Boardroom series. First, this series is being recorded and will be placed on the WCA website along with the PowerPoint presentation, hopefully by the end of the day today. So if you have some colleagues that were unable to join us today for this, they will be able to catch this Zoom webinar, hopefully by the end of the day today. The other thing I want to mention as well before I turn it over to our presenters is that we will be taking questions either through the chat feature or the Q&A feature located usually for most folks. You can find the Q&A and chat feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just click on those, type in your question. I can't promise we will get to it immediately, but I don't think we have had an in the boardroom yet where we have not been able to get through all of the Q&A or the chats that we have received either as they come in or at the end of the meeting. So again, we encourage you to ask questions through either the chat or Q&A as we move through today's webinar. So with that, Andy Phillips, I am told you are going to kick it off today for this very riveting topic where we're going to talk money.
You've used the word riveting 7 times now, Sarah. That means it's important. So, yes, riveting is right because we're talking about a county's ability to raise money for a variety of purposes. In addition, we have issues surrounding a county's ability to issue bonds to support private development. And I know that's a topic that has confronted many counties over the course of the last couple of years. And so this presentation, this discussion is designed to give all of you a foundational understanding of how this system works. Now, you'll be happy to hear that I'm not going to talk the entire time. In fact, I'm going to go on mute after I get done with this introduction. So everybody's going to be happy about that because you're going to learn from three subject matter experts here. We've got Ben Connor, who heads up our public finance team here at Attolles, and he's joined by Andy Guzikowski and Thomas Cameron. So they're going to get you through all of the ins and outs surrounding bond financing and other financing mechanisms within counties. So, Ben, are you going to take it away now?
Yes, sir. Thank you. So like Andy mentioned, we're going to talk about most about revenue bonds today. And there's really two main types of revenue bonds we're going to cover. One where the county is acting as a pass-through conduit issuer for private entities. And then one where the county actually issues its own revenue obligation supported by revenue-making enterprises of the county. My PowerPoint working? There we go. So overview of our discussion today, we'll review various types of county financings. In addition to the revenue obligations I mentioned, we'll give a quick primer on revenue anticipation notes and revenue bond anticipation notes. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about tax considerations, which is, we'll use the word riveting again, extremely riveting. All the federal tax rules that we get to watch out for. So, as you'll all recall, there's a few main types of financings that counties can either issue on their own or participate in. The one you're probably most familiar with that we're not really going to spend much time on today is general obligation debt. So that's where the county issues bonds or notes to finance generally capital improvement projects of the county for building a new courthouse, something like that. That's all governed under Chapter 67 of the Wisconsin statutes. And as you might recall, those are payable, they're general obligations of the county backed by the full faith and credit of the county. So you issue a separate debt levy, property tax levy to pay for those bonds. Um, we have leases, so a tool to finance capital assets, where when the payments are subject to appropriation, the lease payments are subject to appropriation. That's not debt. So if you could have a situation where you have a lease that you have to be careful that it doesn't become general obligation debt. So you have to have some special language in there to make sure that's not an issue. And then the core of what our presentation today is going to be about. We have revenue anticipation notes and revenue bond anticipation notes. Those are short-term debt securities, which you issue in anticipation of issuing long-term debt later. You just might need money more quickly than what makes sense or is possible to issue the longer-term debt. And then revenue obligations, those are bonds or notes issued by the county to finance what's called a public utility under the statutes. Things like streetlights, swimming pools, hospitals, parks, anything that's going to generate revenue, and that revenue is going to serve as the payment source and security for those bonds rather than a separate property tax. And then finally, conduit revenue bonds, and that's where the county, as I mentioned before, acts as just a pass-through conduit issuer for a private entity, and there's certain types of entities and projects that are allowed to be financed with those types of bonds, and that's all governed by state statute as well. So Thomas, do you want to cover revenue anticipation notes?
Sure. So we don't see a lot of revenue anticipation notes being issued by counties, but it is a tool in the toolbox, and it really is most often used as sort of a cash flow borrowing mechanism. We see it a lot with school districts. So it's a short-term note. As the slides say, there's a very limited time period that you have to repay it within 18 months of the first day of the fiscal year in which they're issued. So pretty short term, especially compared to like a GO bond or a GO note that can go out 20 years. And they need to be issued in the same fiscal year in which the county is entitled to receive the payments. So the idea here is essentially there's going to be a receipt of payments by the county. You don't have that money yet, but you're looking to do something with that money. And there's a limit where you can only issue that revenue anticipation note for up to 60% of the anticipated revenue. So you can't borrow more than the anticipated revenue, or even up to the anticipated revenue amount.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a hedge, I think, built into the statute, just in case maybe you don't receive all you were anticipating receiving later on.
I was just
And
going to add in here too, is that you're right, Thomas. We don't see those being issued by counties very much. I will tell you that the last time I'm aware of that we had a discussion about a broad-based revenue anticipation note program was during the COVID-19 pandemic. If everybody recalls, we had the shutdown in March, and we were concerned that there would be high rates of delinquencies on property taxes. And so, from a cash flow perspective, we wanted to provide counties with an opportunity to weather that storm, if you will. So, we worked with an underwriter in putting together a revenue anticipation note program to cover that cash flow issue. But thankfully, it was never used because there was not a significant, it was an uptick in delinquencies, but not significant enough to where counties had to borrow in anticipation of those tax revenues coming in. But that's an example of how a revenue anticipation note can be used.
yep.
Ben, can you advance to the next slide? Yeah, so there's two main benefits to revenue anticipation notes. The first is that it's not, and they're really related, it's not backed by tax levy, which means you're not levying for that payment. The payment for the revenue anticipation note is the money you're going to receive in the future. And as a result, it's also not considered general obligation debt, so it doesn't count towards your debt limit. What we do see more often is sort of these words shuffled up in a slightly different order. And we do see bond anticipation notes or revenue bond anticipation notes. And this is in some ways sort of a cousin to the bond anticipation or the revenue anticipation note. And here, instead of it being tied to maybe the receipt of property tax revenues or something else, it is a short-term note that you're issuing in anticipation of issuing longer-term debt down the road. And because of that structure, you can issue these notes for longer term. They can be issued for up to 5 years, and you can essentially refinance them as well to extend them to go up to 10 years. Why would you use this tool? Ben, if you can advance to the next slide. Again, two of the main benefits relate to the same idea of a revenue anticipation note. There's still no tax levy required, and it's not considered a general obligation debt of the county. You can use it for interim financing for a larger project. So towards the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about some tax considerations. One of the tax considerations is how long is it going to take you to spend the money? And if you have a project of a certain size, it can be challenging to spend money quickly enough to meet some of the spend down requirements. So if you issue interim financing instead, that can be a tool to help take advantage of tax exempt rates while also staying compliant with just project realities. A revenue obligation, and this is normally a revenue bond, is what we're talking about, but the statute uses the term revenue obligation. This is a bond or a note that is used to finance public utilities. And often when you think about public utility, you might think of water, sewer, electric, sort of things of that sort. And those all qualify, but it can be broader than that. And it can include things like streetlights or parks or swimming pools or hospitals. And the real key is that it's a revenue producing facility owned by a municipality. In this context, municipality does include county, and it's operated for a public purpose. Structurally, these bonds are not general obligation bonds. They're secured by a pledge of the revenue. So the idea is the streetlights might have rates associated with them. The sewerage system might have a rate associated with them. The park might have a usage fee, and that revenue is going to be sufficient to pay for the bonds. Those bonds, unlike general obligation bonds, can go out 40 years. So you can go out longer, which can allow for some helpful structuring, especially if you think it's going to take some time before a new revenue generating entity is going to be able to generate enough revenue to make those bond payments. Again, because they aren't general obligation bonds, there's no tax levy required. That also means it's not general obligation debt, so it doesn't count towards the debt limit. But it's also not secured by any other assets of the county. So it's sort of a standalone thing where as long as the revenue generating entity makes enough revenue, everyone's happy. And if it doesn't make enough revenue, the bondholder's only remedy is to go after that revenue source. It doesn't open up the full faith and credit of the county or other revenue sources that might be in play.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. While that is the bondholder's own only actual remedy, it's generally in the best interest of the county or whoever has issued the bonds to, if the revenues are short one year, to make up that payment elsewhere, because obviously you prefer not to default on your payment obligation. So, like Thomas mentioned, the only source of security for the bondholders is that revenue, but the county can take other money to pay if there's ever a year where there's a shortfall, to avoid defaulting on their bond obligations.
And in an effort to mitigate that, often there will be a reserve fund to help deal with shortfalls. And in general, the purchaser of the bonds is going to want to see revenue or projection of revenue in excess of the debt service on the bonds. So the exact amount is going to depend on the nature of the deal. But someone purchasing the bonds is going to want to have comfort that they have a reason to believe the bonds will be repaid.
And another point on this one is that in addition to the pledge revenues, the county does have the ability to actually pledge a mortgage on the facility that's financed with the bond proceeds. There's a lot of nuances to it in this case because you have to be very careful about what you pledge. It has to, it can only be property directly paid for with the bond proceeds. Um, but that is another. It's not a requirement, but it's not a statutory requirement, but it's often required by investors as additional security.
And that's sort of a very abstract discussion of revenue obligations. On the next slide is a much more specific example where Lafayette County issued a revenue obligation to support their hospital and clinic operation. Ben, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so and we made sure Lafayette County was okay with us talking about this example of presentation. If anyone from Lafayette County is on, but we represented Lafayette County couple of years ago, or over a couple of years for various stages of this project. The Lafayette County owns and operates a county hospital now known as Lafayette Hospital and Clinics. It's an enterprise fund of the county, so it is a public utility under the statute. It's a revenue generating asset. And so the county's existing facility was at the end of its useful life, and they wanted to replace it with a new facility at a cost of approximately $52 million. So, then you have to figure out, okay, how are we going to pay for that? That's a big price tag, but it's a very important service to the Lafayette County community. So the county was able to finance the project. They were able to secure USDA financing. So they got a very favorable rate from USDA, which made the project possible. And it was really a mixed source of funding for the project. The county, well, first there were basically what were revenue anticipation, or sorry, bond anticipation notes issued for interim financing for the project. That's actually a USDA requirement, which is part of the reason that was used for this project. So there was an initial financing, they built the hospital, and then the permanent financing with the USDA paid off the interim financing. So the ultimate funding source for the permanent financing was a mix of revenue obligations, general obligation bonds, and federal grants. So in this case, the revenue produced or anticipated to be produced by the hospital wasn't going, projecting to be enough to pay for all of the debt service. So they were able to kind of mix and match some things. So the reason for doing that, and even though you still have to issue some GO bonds and go through that whole process, it's still advantageous to the county to issue the revenue obligations because they're keeping a large portion of the debt off the debt limit books and off the tax roll. So how are we able to use revenue obligations for this project? Again, the hospital qualifies as a public utility. It's a revenue producing facility. The hospital revenues, again, were pledged as the repayment source for the revenue obligations. And as I alluded to earlier, the county also granted a mortgage on the new hospital facility, which is additional security for the revenue obligations that was required by USDA. Again, as I said, you have to be careful when you're pledging mortgages with bond finance property because of the way the Wisconsin statutes and constitution work. You can't just pledge any old asset of the county. It has to be specifically property financed with bond proceeds. And then you can run into all sorts of problems, or maybe problems is a strong word, but potential issues later on if you were to, let's say, add on to the facility with money other than bond proceeds. So there's lots of things to think through there. As I mentioned, the revenue generated by the hospital wasn't enough to support the entire loan from USDA. So a portion was financed with the GO bonds. So basically the breakdown was it was almost $31 million was supported by revenue obligations. So again, that's $31 million that was not placed on the tax roll, or at least the repayments were not placed on the tax roll. and did not count against the county's debt limit. So then they only had to issue $15 million of GO bonds, which was really favorable in this instance instead of issuing 45 or almost, I guess, $46 million of GO bonds. And then the rest of the project was financed by federal grants. So it was a really interesting project, a really creative structure to pull together all these different sources to get a really good result. And we have a question in the chat. How does this work for streetlights with no anticipated revenue stream? Well, I guess if you have no anticipated revenue stream, you wouldn't be able to finance them this way. It'd really be if you were charging a user fee, and those fees are what would be your revenue that's generated.
So a streetlight can be a public utility, and then as long as there is a revenue stream to go with it, then you could issue the revenue obligations.
Yeah, and if you weren't going to have a separate fee, you really just if you're going to finance it, you'd have to issue general obligation debt and have the additional property tax levy. So that was kind of the general overview of what revenue obligations look like. Now we're going to get into what a conduit revenue bond is. Thomas or Andy, do you want to take that?
Andy, do you want
Andy's on mute. I assume he was referring referring
to?
over to
I can,
Thomas.
sure, I can.
I was going to refer this one to Thomas.
Sure, I can run with this one. So if a revenue bond is pledging revenues of the county or of the municipality, a conduit revenue bond is sort of a variation on that. Counties can issue bonds. Sometimes they're called industrial revenue bonds or IRBs. And in this role, the county is really working with a private developer to finance a project. As the slides say, it says industrial. That's sort of a misnomer in the statute. There's a lot of things that I wouldn't describe as being industrial, like certain agricultural uses, which can be financed with a quote unquote industrial revenue bond. These industrial revenue bonds need to be repaid within 35 years, so not quite as long a payback period as a normal county revenue bond, but still a lengthy period. And the key idea behind a conduit revenue bond is that the private borrower is the one on the hook to make the payment. So the county would be the issuer, the developer would be the borrower, and then they would be the ones making the payments. So the county, once they've issued that, they are, as the name suggests, a conduit to the borrowing. But they are not going to be an active participant in the development of the project or of the repayment of those bonds. There are statutorily, there's a number of entities that potentially could be the issuer. We see many cities and villages play an active role as being a conduit issuer for industrial revenue bonds. Less so with counties, but it definitely is possible. And the big benefit that the developer gets is they can potentially receive a tax-exempt financing rate for their private project. So that interest rate savings can be really significant as they're looking at how to develop a project and how to make it finance. So most county municipal borrowings are issued on a tax-exempt basis unless there's a very specific reason why it doesn't fit into the criteria. We'll talk about some of those in a few slides. Private developers generally don't get that interest rate. And the idea is that a tax-exempt interest rate is going to be at least a little bit lower than a taxable interest rate. So that interest rate savings can be really of interest to developers. Ben, do you want to advance? Yep. So as I sort of alluded to, the county borrows the money. They sell those conduit revenue bonds. The county lends the money to the private borrower. The county steps aside, and then the relationship really is with the private borrower and the bondholders or the lender. Sometimes this will be a local bank. Sometimes it will be a larger commercial underwriter who purchases this sort of loan or this sort of financing. There's a lot of sub steps within that, a lot of documentation, a lot of paperwork, particularly to make sure that the county isn't left holding the bag, because the county is the issuer. And as the issuer, and if you're issuing, county of Y revenue bonds, industrial revenue bonds, you do want to make sure that no one's going to be coming to county of Y looking for repayment of that bond. So making sure that everything is documented appropriately, and it's made very clear that, as the second bullet point says, the borrower is paying all of the costs associated with issuing the bonds. This is being done really as a favor to the private developer. It's being done to incentivize development, but the expectation is not that the county is going to incur any costs as part of doing this. And there should be enough savings associated with structuring the deal in this way, where the developer is happy, or as happy as developers are to make payments, to make those payments. It can be a really useful economic development tool. One of my favorite economic development tools is the one where the county doesn't have to kick in its own money. And this is definitely one of those tools. Like with the other bonds we've talked about in some depth today, this is not a charge against the county's general credit. This is not general obligation. There's no tax levy. And it is that limited obligation of the county and the only stream of payments that a bondholder can go after is the revenues from that private developer. Unlike with a revenue bond, I would say there's virtually no expectation that the county is going to fix a shortfall if the developer is short. That's a risk that the purchaser of the bonds is undertaking. They fully understand it. And all the transaction documents are going to be incredibly clear that the county is issuing these, but is not on the hook at all.
Yep. And just to further the economic development point, I mean, sometimes you see these projects, especially smaller projects, or if it involves not-for-profits, the tax exempt rate versus versus taxable rate can make or break the project. So I mean, some projects just can't happen without this incentive. So now we're going to get into the really fun part and talk about tax rules. This is Andy's time to shine, I think.
Can I talk now?
Yep.
Okay, there's a reason we put the tax section last, because it is truly the most riveting portion of this riveting presentation. So I will now kind of walk you through, try not to read from the slides. I think we all understand that the lower the interest rate, the more savings to the ultimate borrower, whoever that is, if it's the county itself through GO or an enterprise or public utility, or a private borrower, they all benefit from a pass-through of the municipality or government or county's ability to issue bonds on a federally tax exempt basis. I guess you can go ahead and roll it then. At any rate, so for tax purposes, bonds are divided into three categories, much like under the Wisconsin and most state statutes. There's a general obligation bond, which is really secured by the county and its portion of the ad valorem taxes. That is general obligation bonds 101. And the tax code treats those types of obligations fairly liberally. Municipal revenue bonds, and we talked about public utilities and secured only by the project and the revenues. For federal tax purposes, those of course can be tax exempt, and most of them are. But there are a few more rules than there are with general obligation bonds. There's a reason for that because, okay. Next, we'll get into, and we'll talk a little bit about what are known, what we've spoken about here as conduit revenue bonds, and what federal law treats or calls a private activity bond. And we'll get into some of the blurring that can happen as in the three sort of types of bonds. There's some blurring between those categories that I'll talk about real briefly. So requirements for tax exemption are really pretty simple, and a county doesn't really need to worry about the valid issuance of the bonds as long as you issue them for a proper purpose. The statute authorizes them, and you follow all the state rules, then you have a validly issued obligation or bond under state law. And that is step number one in entitling the bond to be tax exempt. The bond also has to constitute indebtedness. That's a two-part process. One is an actual obligation to pay. There can sometimes be structuring that creative structuring, like leases, where that bona fide legal obligation is called into question or a little bit fuzzy. And a reasonable expectation of payment, that there has to be sufficient expectation that the sources of the funds will be sufficient to pay the debt service on the bonds. So, Ben, you want to? All right. So we've got the basic qualifying. In terms of borrowing, the three limits that are applicable to all sorts of bonds or all types of bonds are: you can't borrow too much, too soon, or for too long. And you understand that the federal government is, of course, subsidizing these activities, whether they're direct government activities, as with a general obligation bond or a public utility, or the conduit revenue borrower. The IRS or the federal government is subsidizing this by accepting fewer taxes than it would if the bonds were not tax exempt. The other important thing, and much of the tax code and much of the complexity of the tax code in this area deals with arbitrage, which of course is you borrow at 5%, you invest at 6%, and you keep the difference. Well, you can't, at least not if the borrowing is through a tax exempt bond. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit more detail. So Ben, if you could flip the slide. All right. You can't borrow too much. And there is with some exceptions, a strong preference, if you will, for capital projects being financed on a tax exempt basis. And I guess that really the capital project is obviously an accounting term, a legal term. What's a capital expenditure? But there is a section of the code that allows working capital borrowings that is not similar to what Thomas referred to as cash flow borrowings. and there are special rules for those. But generally, for the types of bonds we're talking about, industrial revenue bonds, general obligation bonds, it's going to finance capital projects. So there's not usually much difficulty identifying what are your capital expenses, and your auditors or your internal accounting people will tell you what that is. And then once bonds are issued, they can be refinanced. And essentially, when you refinance bonds, or refunding bonds is the tax term, you are issuing bonds to pay off an earlier issue of bonds, maybe for interest rate savings. Rates have gone down, or maybe for a more favorable set of restrictions. When you have a private activity borrower, the lender may impose financial covenants, minimum net worth or minimum liquidity, and you could refinance to change those or get relief from some of those. So the refunding of the bonds, you want to make sure that the bonds that are issued, the later bonds, the refunding bonds, are going to be tax exempt. So you have to look back at what they're paying off. And they could be paying off a bank loan. They could be paying off an actual prior issue of bonds. And you have to make sure that those bonds were tax exempt in the first place, even if they were not issued on a taxable basis for some practical reason. Maybe it was the cost of issuing tax exempt bonds at that time, or something like that. So Ben, can we keep going? All right. You can't borrow too much. I think we covered that. Can't borrow too soon. Basically, you have to proceed. You have to be ready to proceed with the project. These are fairly liberal rules. Within 6 months, you have to reasonably expect or have entered into a binding contract to spend 5% of the bond proceeds. That's a not a very heavy lift. And you must reasonably expect that you're going to get the project done within the next 3 years, or at least spend 85% of the bond proceeds on capital expenditures within a 3-year period. So this is just saying, in effect, if you meet those 3 tests, then you're ready. Your project is ready to be financed, because we're not going to let you have tax exempt bonds outstanding to finance a project somewhere down the road, or a project that you're first starting to plan for, and still have no idea what what the costs and the actual cash flow is going to look like. So that's all we can say about borrowing too soon. And you can't borrow for too long. Again, these are somewhat liberal rules. They get a little more precise when you start folding in the arbitrage considerations. But basically, you can't have a 30-year bond to finance a 10-year fire truck. And you can't take long-term financing. It's like your home equity loan. It doesn't go out. The home equity doesn't go out for 30 years. It goes out for some smaller, some shorter period, for a home improvement loan, let's say, because the assets that you're financing, or the project that you're financing, if it is, as I said, a fire truck, it's not going to last as long as the fire station. So you sort of weight that, you sort of weight that all together and say, well, of all the stuff we're financing, and let's just say it's a fire station and a fire truck, let's see how long those economic life schedules are for tax purposes, like depreciation schedules, and let's blend those together and come up with a weighted average. And that's where the safe harbor test of 120% of the life of the project The bonds can't be out for more than 120% of the life of the project. Usually very easy for capital projects that involve construction, because the reason, except in extremely unusual situations, the economic life is going to be 40 years, and 120% is whatever, 48 years. You're typically financially that's not going to be supportable anyway, and you're going to run into conflicts with state law. For example, the industrial revenue bonds cannot go out for more than 35 years. So anyway, can't borrow for too long. That's a pretty easy concept. And now we'll get into, drum roll please, Ben. Um, uh, Well, very simple. You don't have to be broke to borrow, or to borrow. If you have other money that is not set aside and earmarked for your project, say some fund that the county has been contributing to over a period of years to build the new bridge. If that money is set aside for that purpose and can only be used for that purpose, then you're not going to be able to borrow to, in effect, replace that money and go out and spend that money somewhere else. You're going to have to use that money first, whatever you have set aside. And this becomes a lot more, that becomes a lot more subtle when it comes to private activity bonds or conduit revenue bonds with private borrowers. That can be an issue with, a church doing a fundraising to build a new playground or something like that. So that's all on that. So arbitrage. Before we get to arbitrage, I think we're going to just talk real quickly about a couple of things that are not covered in the slides. I guess too much detail, but a conceptual, just for concept purposes. You saw with the Wisconsin Industrial Revenue Bond statute that there were a whole list of projects that could be financed with it that are not necessarily industrial. Now, there is also a list, if you will, under the tax code of the kinds of projects that can be financed that are not necessarily industrial. And you've got to compare those lists. And the one that most of us have the most experience with, at least I do, is just with the manufacturing. Manufacturing also always has, since the mid 80s, and manufacturing started disappearing from this country. There was a strong emphasis on financing manufacturing projects. So that's where the list starts. And of course, both federal and state law say that a industrial or manufacturing project is very worthy of our subsidizing it through the tax exemption. Then you get into a whole list of other things, and they don't necessarily jibe with the state statutes, which is the idea again is what kinds of projects and what kinds of borrowers. Now we're talking about all types of bonds. What kind of projects and what kind of borrowers should be subsidized? Well, certainly governmental projects should be subsidized. Certainly revenue producing public utilities should be subsidized, but there are some limits on that. There's certain things you can't do with a revenue bond for tax purposes. And then certainly with borrowers, with private activity or conduit revenue bonds, the list is narrower. And generally nonprofits are going to be subsidized by the federal government. The thought is we're subsidizing them anyway, so why not subsidize them some more? And then with other types of borrowers, it's more dependent for conduit revenue bonds on the nature of the project itself. So there's a whole list of, one could make a whole list of types of projects and types of borrowers that um, um, that the federal government deems worthy of being subsidized by the federal government. And that ranges all the way from, general obligation type projects, revenue bonds, private activity bonds are sort of the shortest list, if you will. That's a little bit of a digression. Arbitrage is a big deal. The government is obsessed. The Internal Revenue Code service is obsessed with arbitrage. They do not want you to borrow money at 3% and invest it at 5%. That's a subsidy that produces nothing for the benefit of the federal government. It just lets you earn some more interest. So the general rule is you can't do it. You can't invest at 3% or borrow 3% on a tax exempt basis and then invest at a higher rate and keep the difference. In some cases, you simply cannot even earn it. And there are so you cannot invest it at a yield, is its own concept, but at a yield greater than the yield on the bonds. So essentially, don't do that. But there are some categories of bond proceeds, like like a capitalized interest fund or a debt service reserve, that can be invested at higher rates for periods of time. But so you might want to take advantage of those for various subtle financing reasons. But if you do it, you risk the loss of your tax exemption going back to the first day that you invested that money at a higher yield, which is usually the day the bonds were issued. Now, what you do earn as arbitrage, nevertheless, has to be paid directly to the federal government. So your 3%, 5% differential, let's say that generates $2 million for, well, it's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but let's say it generates $200,000 in additional income for the county. You're going to fill out a form at the end of the first 5 years and send all of those excess earnings to the federal government. So, but what's important are the exceptions. Small issuer governments in smaller counties and smaller municipalities may invest less than 5 million, or may borrow less than 5 million in a year without having to worry about the arbitrage. Spend down, if you spend your money fast enough, and these are a little bit accelerated from the 3-year period I told you about before. But if you spend it all within 6 months, don't worry about arbitrage. If you spend it within 18 months, and you don't worry about arbitrage if certain more stringent rules are applied. And then if you're doing a construction project, you've got an exemption. If you spend it all within 24 months, you don't have to worry about arbitrage. The only quirk with the 24-month exception is it only applies to that portion of your bonds that are used to construct real property. So, Ben? Audit and enforcement, that is where the one thing we said about private activity or industrial revenue bonds earlier was that the county can just step aside. County will never handle any money. That'll be the borrower directly to the trustee or the lender. If there are any changes in the documents that the county didn't sign, side letters or something, the county doesn't have to be bothered with it. Occasionally, there's ministerial things that have to be done at the county level, but those are few and far between. And quite honestly, in most of the industrial revenue bonds and the way they're designed, the county never hears another word about it until they want to come back and borrow more money, and that's a good thing. Um, so the IRS, if a bondholder were to exclude interest on certain bonds that were issued by a county on a tax exempt basis, and it turned out those bonds were taxable, then it would really be the bondholder that did something wrong, if you will, excluded some income that it should have included. Well, that's not good. And uh, in theory, at least, the IRS would go after each individual bondholder. And sometimes with larger bonds and more institutional investors, that is very hard to track down. So essentially, the issuer, the county, would be treated as the taxpayer for purposes, not for purpose of paying any money or paying any fines, unless they did something that wrong, demonstrably wrong. But just for the purpose of working this out and settling up with the IRS. So everything in those situations, and what would happen is bonds are audited, routine audit, let's say. County gets a letter saying we're auditing your bonds. County sends it to the borrower, and county never hears another word. And that's the way it should work with private activity bonds. And any costs incurred by the county, let's say it's photocopying or spending time in a deposition, if that was ever necessary, would have to be secured by the borrower's obligations to the county. So I think that's all on tax considerations. If there's more, oh, okay. So borrowing on a taxable basis, you avoid all this stuff, and potentially lower transaction costs. I think you can cross off potentially. It's going to be lower transaction costs. By the time that you get through the whole tax analysis, it's going to be much more expensive to issue bonds on a tax exempt basis. And that's true whether you're talking about general obligation bonds or revenue bonds or whatever. But the idea is that the tax exemption more than pays for itself. And the rule of thumb that I've always heard from investment bankers is if the money you save on the tax exemption covers your issuance cost, if the money you save over 3 years covers the issuance cost, it's worth it. Now, that's a rule of thumb that could be modernized. I haven't heard that in a few years, but there's generally the notion that interest rate savings will justify higher transaction costs. And you can always issue bonds on a tax exempt taxable basis and then refund them later tax exempt when something changes or some condition that was met or during that 18-month period. Often the bond anticipation notes are taxable, and then the bonds themselves are tax exempt. That's sort of a refunding transaction. So what do we do as bond counsel, Ben? You can answer that or give me another slide. Okay, role of bond counsel. So whenever you do a tax exempt bond, and often even when you do a taxable bond, there's obviously some very complicated analysis associated with that. There's also a lot of document drafting that is very unique to the public finance area or the public finance practice. So usually bond counsel is hired. And what's bond counsel's role? Well, it's to review the documents, and eventually its ultimate objective for bond counsel is to issue an opinion that says these bonds are tax exempt, subject to exclusions and disclaimers that as long as you're armed, but basically an opinion on the tax exemption is what bond counsel is shooting for. So in order to do that, bond counsel has to do an analysis, has to know everything, which makes it kind of tough for bond counsel to keep his client's secrets. If something funny is going on or something unusual, the bond counsel is going to have to know about it and have to tell everybody else about it. I'm going to add one thing, which I think we may have skipped the slide or I didn't get it in, but it's very quick. General obligation bonds or revenue bonds. Often, let's take an example of a municipal parking garage where the county is going to finance a parking garage and finance with revenues. There's a concept that if that public utility generates private activity, you're not going to be able to issue on a tax exempt basis. So for example, if you hire a manager for that project, that public utility, and the contract is too long, more than whatever the rules say it should be, and or the manager is getting paid a commission rather than a flat rate for managing that lot. There's this whole idea of qualified management agreements. And that's something that when you issue general obligation bonds, and in particular, revenue obligations for public utilities, you have to be aware of that the contracts dealing with the project are usually private contracts. And if those are operated for private profit, under certain circumstances, that can prevent you from issuing the bonds on a tax exempt basis. And I hope you think that was riveting. No, no hands are raised.
Yeah, so that brings us to the end of our slides. Happy to answer any questions, but I know that was kind of a lot of information and it's some complicated topics. Question, what money is tax exempt? What would it otherwise be taxed?
It's the interest on the bonds, just like you get interest on your a bank account, and you get a little 1099 at the end of the year says you earned $402 in interest, you got to pay tax on that. Well, in this case, you get a 1099 from the bond trustee that would say you earned $400 interest, and you wouldn't count that. You wouldn't put it as part of income. You would know that it was tax exempt. So it's the interest on the bonds that would ordinarily be taxable income that is excluded from your income for that purpose.
Yeah, so basically, let's say the bank or a bank lends the county money, and the bank makes $10,000 of money off of the interest payments that year, and it's tax exempt. They don't have to pay taxes on the $10,000. So because of that, the bank's going to be willing to give you a 4% rate instead of 6%. They're willing to take less income because they don't have to pay taxes on it. So that's where that benefit comes from.
Because at the end of the day, they'll have the same amount of gain because they don't have to pay taxes on it, is sort of the idea of the math. Exactly how the math works out for any particular deal, taxable versus tax exempt. There's sort of so many factors that go into a particular interest rate. It's hard to know sort of exactly how does it work out, but conceptually, that's the idea.
All right. As of now, I'm not seeing any other questions, but we do. Oh, another question just popped in for you guys.
Could a county use one of the revenue bond options to build a capital package to fund the development of an affordable housing project? And could the rent payments be used to fund the debt payments? So I think we're saying here that is the idea that the county would own the housing project, or is it acting as the conduit issuer? But I mean, yes, you could. I mean, one of the more common things is you'd see the county or a county housing authority act as the conduit issuer. So then the borrower would be the private developer who would build the apartment building. There'd be income restrictions on the tenants' ability, who can rent the apartments. And then, yeah, the developer would pledge those rent payments as the payment source for the bonds.
Yeah, I think there's like 87 different factors in that question, and one of them even relates to when we say affordable housing project, what exactly do we mean?
Yeah,
Sometimes it's what I would call capital A affordable. That's the federal tax credit qualifies for affordable. Sometimes when local governments say affordable, what they really mean is a term sometimes described as workforce housing, which would be above those income qualifying levels and maybe a little bit closer to theoretical market rate, but can't afford housing in the community. Um, so sort of depending on how all of those definitions shake out, easier or harder to do as a financing tool.
yeah, but yeah, either the county itself or some counties have housing authorities that they've created can typically issue those bonds.
All right. I was going to say we can give it another minute or so in case anybody is typing in the question. In the meantime, I just want to thank our presenters for today and preview our July 22nd in the boardroom, where we will be back. Andy Phillips, I believe, will be joining us on July 22nd, where he will tell us why we should embrace the structural beauty of parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order. So while today was riveting, we are going to embrace the structural beauty of parliamentary procedure in July. So again, Andy, Ben, and Thomas, I'm wondering, did we put Andy Phillips to sleep today? As we have not seen his camera come back on yet. Oh, we're
He
called him
left.
out. We called you out. There he is.
I'm here, yes, but thank you for calling me out. But yes, I'm here and I did not go to sleep, so it's all good.
I did. I actually learned a lot during this presentation. So I appreciate the work that everybody put into of this presentation today. Again, as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be placed on our website along with the PowerPoint presentation. So again, thank you guys very much for your presentation today. Very informative, and we will see everybody back on July 22nd. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.